On the 17th of March, 1997, a Lockheed Electra 10E prepared to take off from Oakland, California. Exactly 60 years earlier to the day, an identical aircraft had left the same airport at the start of what the pilot hoped would be an epic trailblazing flight. Now Texan Linda Finch was setting out to follow in the footsteps of a famous American aviatrix. This was Amelia Earhart, who in 1937 had set her heart on flying around the world, a dream that she never fulfilled. During the next 10 weeks, Linda Finch flew over 26,000 miles, visiting 20 countries on 6 continents. On the 28th of June, 1997, she landed back at Oakland. Linda Finch had not only achieved the dream of a lifetime, but had done so in the true spirit of those who made the world's headlines in the golden age of flight during the 1920s and 1930s.
Well, I realized as a result of this trip that I can do a lot more than I believed I could. And no matter, I guess, where we set our limits, there's always more we can do.
So too thought the early Trailblazers. Before the Great War of 1914-18, when powered flight was still in its infancy, the prospect of crossing the Atlantic or the Pacific by air was but a distant dream. Yet in 1913, the London Daily Mail offered a prize of £10,000 for the first aircraft to fly the Atlantic non-stop. 1914-18, however, witnessed great strides in aviation technology. Indeed, by 1918, aircraft like the Vickers Vimy bomber could fly considerably further than the flimsy planes of 4 years earlier. The Daily Mail prize was still waiting to be won, and almost as soon as the war was over, airmen in Britain were determined to win it. What they all realized was that the predominant wind over the Atlantic blows from west to east. Therefore, any attempt to fly the Atlantic must be from America. No less than 9 British teams declared their interest, and some traveled with their aircraft across the Atlantic, planning to take off from Newfoundland. But while the British teams were gathering, 3 US Navy Curtiss flying boats took off from Trepassey Bay, Newfoundland on the 15th of May, 1919, with the aim of stealing a march. Two of the Curtisses were forced to land on the sea with engine trouble. The third, commanded by Lieutenant Commander A.C. Reed, landed in the Azores after a flight of 15 hours. But reaching the Azores did not mean that Reed had conquered the Atlantic, especially as bad weather delayed him from flying on to mainland Europe. Next to try was Australian Harry Hawker, who took off from Newfoundland in his Sopwith on the 18th of May, 1919. He was closely followed by Captain R.F. Raynham, who crashed on takeoff. Nothing more was heard from Hawker. By now, Commander Reed had taken off from the Azores and flown via Portugal to Britain, where, in spite of not qualifying for the Daily Mail prize, he received a warm welcome. As the days passed, hopes that Harry Hawker was still alive faded. But a week after he had taken off, news came through that he and his mechanic were alive and well. Forced to ditch because of radiator problems, they had been rescued by a passing vessel which had no radio. This brought them back to Scotland, from where they travelled by train to London. Here, Hawker and his mechanic were given a hero's welcome for having seemingly returned from the dead. The other British teams had fallen by the wayside, apart from one. Captain John Alcock and Lieutenant Arthur Whitten Brown took off from Newfoundland in their Vickers Vimy bomber on the 14th of June, 1919. After battling in their open cockpit for 16 hours through darkness, heavy cloud, sleet and snow, they reached the Irish coast. But what they thought was a tempting green field turned out to be a bog, and the Vimy ended up ignominiously on its nose. But this did not matter. Alcock and Brown had flown the Atlantic non-stop and had won the Daily Mail prize. They were the heroes of the hour, and both were knighted by the King. Sadly, Sir John Alcock was killed in an air crash 6 months later. Alcock and Brown's feat, however, has a permanent memorial in the statue of them at London's Heathrow Airport. But if heavier-than-air machines could cross the Atlantic, so too could airships. Indeed, in 1917, a German Zeppelin had flown from Bulgaria to Sudan and back, a round trip of some 6,000 miles. Now, in July 1919, a few weeks after Alcock and Brown's epic flight, the British airship R-34, which was based on a Zeppelin design, set off from Scotland to cross the Atlantic. R-34 completed the flight in 108 hours, landing at Lakehurst, outside New York. This marked the first east-west aerial crossing of the Atlantic. 3 days later, R-34 returned to England, this time taking just 75 hours. The crew enjoyed much more comfort than the pilots of the transatlantic aircraft in their open cockpits. The next milestone was reached in March 1922, when Portuguese captains Sacadura Cabral and Gago Coutinho became the first to fly the South Atlantic. But it took them some 3 months and many mishaps, including crashing their Fairey 3 aircraft, before they finally reached Rio de Janeiro. Then in 1924 came the first round-the-world flight, which took in part of the North Atlantic. Four specially designed Douglas World Cruisers, with detachable floats and flown by US Army aviators, took off from Seattle, Washington State, on the 12th of March, 1924. They aimed to circumnavigate from east to west. One world cruiser crashed in Alaska, but the remaining 3, often joined briefly by other aircraft, flew on across China, India, and the Middle East. After arriving in Paris on the 14th of July, the French National Day, the world cruisers flew on to Britain. Public interest in their flight was typical of what they had experienced throughout their travels. One aircraft had to pull out with engine problems, but the remaining two flew from Scotland via Greenland back to North America. The crews eventually arrived back at Seattle at the end of September 1924, having flown over 26,000 miles in 175 days. They had achieved this in 57 separate stages, but there was more to come. St. Louis, Missouri businessman Raymond Ortegue now offered a generous prize for the first person to fly non-stop between Paris and New York. Two of France's most famous fighter races of the Great War were the first to try. One was René Fonck, who took off in a Sikorsky trimotor from New York in September 1926. But he never got off the ground. Two crew members perished in the resultant fire. Fonck was lucky to survive. Then Charles Nungesser, with co-pilot Charles Colli, tried with a specially designed Levasseur from Paris in early May 1927. Nothing more was seen or heard of them after they left the French coast. But three American airmen had also set their sights on the Ortegue prize. One was Lieutenant Commander Richard Byrd, U.S. Navy, who had been making a name for himself for his flights over the Arctic. The second was Clarence Chamberlain, another experienced pilot. The final American entrant was a diffident young man called Charles Augustus Lindbergh, a stunt pilot by trade. Not only did Lindbergh declare that he would fly the Atlantic solo, but that he would do it in a single-engine aircraft. The press dubbed him the Flying Fool. Lindbergh named his Ryan aircraft the Spirit of St. Louis, in honor of businessmen of that city who were sponsoring him. The plane was designed and built in San Diego in just 2 months, and in his rush to beat his competitors, Lindbergh flew it from San Diego to New York in a record time of little over 14 hours. Lindbergh's rivals believed that it would take him some time to get prepared, but on the 20th of May, 1927, just 10 days after his flight from San Diego, he took off from Roosevelt Field, New York. Although short of sleep, he was determined to take advantage of a favorable weather forecast. For the next 33.5 hours, Lindbergh struggled against fog and ice. But above all, he had to fight against his growing fatigue. Keeping his eyes open became an uphill battle. Somehow he managed to stay awake as he flew ever closer to his goal. At last, Lindbergh reached the French coast. He came into land at Paris's Le Bourget airport at 10:30 local time in the evening of the 21st of May, 1927. Lindbergh later recorded,
"That reception was the most dangerous part of my trip. Never in my life have I seen anything like that human scene. It isn't clear to me yet what happened. Before I knew it, I'd been hoisted out of the cockpit, and one moment was on the shoulders of some men and the next moment on the ground. It seemed even more dangerous for my plane than for me. I saw one man wrench away the switch and another took something out of the cockpit. Then, when they started cutting pieces of cloth from the wings, I struggled to get back to the plane, but it was impossible.
Lindbergh was now an international celebrity and would remain so for the rest of his life. Two weeks after Lindbergh's great flight, his rival Clarence Chamberlain and his sponsor, millionaire Charles Levine, flew their Belanca from New York to Eisleben in Germany. Their flight of nearly 4,000 miles in 42 hours broke Lindbergh's distance record. Lindbergh's other rival, Richard Byrd, also made an Atlantic crossing at the end of June 1927. In the company of 3 other crew members, he flew his Fokker C-2 from New York to the French coast in 46 hours before he was forced to make an emergency landing. But his flight was noteworthy in being the first to carry airmail from America to Europe. Women too were keen to fly the Atlantic, but it seemed as though fate was conspiring against them. Princess Löwenstein-Wertheim was the first woman to attempt an Atlantic flight when she and 2 male pilots set off from England at the end of August 1927. They were presumed lost at sea. October 1927 saw 2 further attempts by women, including that by Americans Ruth Elder and George Haldeman in a Stimson. Their journey ended in Portugal after they'd been forced down over the sea and had been rescued by a passing liner. On Christmas Eve 1927, another American, Mrs. F.W. Grayson, took off from New York with 3 others in a Sikorsky amphibian bound for Paris. They never reached their destination. In March 1928, wealthy British socialite Elsie Mackay tried an east-west crossing with a male pilot, but they too were lost over the sea. It seemed as though it would never end. 30-year-old Amelia Earhart, who'd been born in Atchison, Kansas, but now lived in Boston, was determined to break the spell. After having been a nurse, stunt pilot, photographer, and medical student, she'd become a social worker, with little thought of flying except as a hobby. However, in 1928, a wealthy British woman, Mrs. Frederick Guest, purchased a Fokker trimotor and enlisted the services of 2 pilots so that she could be the first woman to fly the Atlantic. Mrs. Guest's family forced her to pull out of the venture, but as she'd been organizing it from Boston, she selected Amelia Earhart to take her place. With her 2 male companions, Earhart took off from Newfoundland on the 17th of June 1928. She herself was not allowed to fly the plane because she was as yet unqualified on instrument flying. Nearly 21 hours later, they landed in South Wales. Amelia had broken the spell against women flying the Atlantic and became, like Lindbergh, an instant celebrity. Reveling in the adoration that now surrounded her, Amelia Earhart set her heart on becoming an aviation record breaker. In July 1932, piloting a Lockheed Vega, she became the first woman to fly non-stop across the United States, a distance of almost 2,500 miles. The following month, she repeated the flight in the other direction.
It took me about 19 hours and a few minutes to make the trip. I wish I could have done it faster.
And what did you carry on the trip?
You mean to eat?
Yeah, to eat and drink.
Well, I carried some water, of course, because my cockpit is very warm. And I carried a sandwich in case. I didn't eat it, though. I carried some hot chocolate and the old reliable tomato juice.
What kind of a sandwich was it?
Chicken sandwich.
You haven't got that around now, have you?
Yes, I have it in the cockpit.
Earhart also achieved the world altitude record for an autogyro. She flew to a height of almost 18,500 feet.
So was it very cold now? Was it freezing?
Oh, it probably was freezing. It felt so. My hands got a little cold.
Well, no, you
My
couldn't.
nose.
How fast were you going, do you think, at the time that you reached the ceiling?
Oh, I was climbing about 100 feet a minute, I should say. And I ran out of gasoline.
Did you come down very fast?
No, I came down gently because it might hurt one's ears if one comes down too fast.
But Amelia Earhart's crowning moment had been in May 1932. She took off in her Lockheed Vega to fly the Atlantic solo from Newfoundland to Ireland. After landing here, she flew on to England. There she received a rapturous welcome.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here in England. I really had no objective when I started. I struck rain like this on the way across, so I'm not unaccustomed to this at all. It's rather a pleasure, in fact.
But Earhart was aware that her record-breaking flight was not just an end in itself.
I do not think that such solo trips as mine will become commonplace very soon. However, I foresee regular transatlantic service established certainly within our lifetimes.
Because of the prevailing winds, it was not until April 1928 that the first non-stop east-west crossing of the Atlantic was made. The successful crew consisted of two Germans, Captain Hermann Kohl and Baron Gunther von Hoynefeld, and an Irishman, Commandant James Fitzmaurice. The following year, 1929, witnessed a more bizarre Atlantic flying adventure when the crew of a French aircraft called Yellow Bird challenged the American Green Flash to a straight race across the ocean. Green Flash took off first from a beach at Old Orchard, Maine, but was impeded by the waves. Yellow Bird managed, however, to get airborne. The Bernard 191 flew to Santander in Spain and then on to Paris. But during the flight, the three-man crew discovered that they had a stowaway on board, an American cub reporter eager for a scoop. Trailblazing Atlantic flights continued well into the 1930s, before aircraft and airships established commercial routes across the ocean. But elsewhere in the world, the Trailblazers had also been catching the public's imagination. In early 1919, Britain had a large number of servicemen from the Empire who were impatient to return home to the other side of the globe. Among them were a number of airmen. Australian Prime Minister William Hughes now announced a prize for the first Australian to fly from Britain to his homeland. But first to set off, on the 14th of October 1919, was a Frenchman in a Caudron bomber. This was even though he was not eligible for the £10,000 prize. Poulet was followed by a Sopwith Wallaby, with Australians Matthew and Kay at the controls. Two brothers, Ross and Keith Smith, made up the third team. The aircraft they chose was a Vickers Vimy, the same type that had made the first non-stop transatlantic flight earlier that year. But unlike Alcock and Brown, the Smiths took two experienced mechanics with them. They departed on the 12th of November 1919 from Hounslow Airport on the outskirts of London. Their route took them over France and Italy, and then across the Mediterranean to Egypt. Stopping in Cairo for one night, they flew on eastwards to Basra in present-day Iraq, and then on to India. Here they caught up with and overtook the Frenchman Poulet. On the 4th of December, the Smith brothers reached Singapore. Here they spent a day overhauling the Vimy for the final stages of their great flight. This was to take them over present-day Indonesia and across the Timor Sea to northern Australia. Eventually, on the 10th of December, the Smiths appeared in the skies above Darwin. Below them, crowds gathered to watch them land. They had flown 11,300 miles in 28 days and had won the Australian government's prize. Like Alcock and Brown, the Smiths were knighted. Sadly, within 3 years, Sir Ross Smith, like Sir John Alcock, was killed in a crash. In 1920, South African Air Force officers Quintin Brand and Pierre van Reinfeldt flew from London to South Africa. They spent only just over 4.5 days out of 46 in the air and crashed 2 Vickers Vimys in Africa. They finally arrived at Cape Town in a borrowed DH-9, which had been flown to the site of their second crash. In the mid-1920s, attention in the British Empire became focused on one man. This was Alan Cobham, who carried out 3 epic flights, which were surveys for establishing commercial air routes between Britain and the Empire. In 1924, Cobham flew to Rangoon in Burma and back. The following year, he examined the route to South Africa, taking a movie cameraman with him. They shot unique film of some of the ancient wonders of the world. Cobham was an excellent publicist, and wherever he landed, large crowds were there to greet him. This was even in the midst of the African bush, where people had never before seen an aircraft. When Cobham eventually reached Cape Town, 3 months after he'd set out from London, he received a tumultuous welcome. There was even more excitement when Cobham finally arrived back in Britain, where every step of his progress had been eagerly monitored. He and his crew were the heroes of the day. People flocked to the cinema to see his spectacular film of sights like the Victoria Falls. Cobham's final major flight took place in 1926, when he flew to Australia. He celebrated his return to London by flying low over the River Thames and landing by the Houses of Parliament. Cobham's trailblazing flights did much to establish commercial air routes throughout the British Empire, and he received a well-deserved knighthood. In 1928, Australian Bert Hinkler became the first person to fly solo from England to Australia. It took him just 16 days in his tiny Avro avian. This triggered a competition for the fastest solo flight between the two countries. First to challenge Hinkler's record was a 26-year-old girl from the north of England. Amy Johnson had worked as a secretary to pay for flying lessons. She also became the first qualified female aircraft mechanic in Britain. She bought a second-hand de Havilland Gypsy Moth, which she called Jason, but no one took much notice of her intention to challenge Bert Hinkler, especially since she'd only held a pilot's license for a year. Undaunted, Amy Johnson took off from London's Croydon Airport on the 5th of May, 1930. Six days later, she reached Karachi in present-day Pakistan, having flown a daily average of 700 miles. She flew on to Calcutta and looked set to beat Hinkler's time by at least 2 days. Suddenly, the world began to take notice of Amy. But then bad weather intervened. She had to make a forced landing in Burma, and repairs to her aircraft put her behind schedule. But Amy pressed on, with the world willing her to reach her destination, Darwin. She arrived here on the 25th of May, 1930, 20 days after she set out. However, her exhaustion caused her to make a mess of her landing. In spite of this, and the fact that she had taken 4 days longer than Hinkler, Amy Johnson became the darling of the British Empire, as Amelia Earhart was of America. Amy made more epic flights. She married fellow British trailblazer Jim Mollison. The two became the first husband and wife to fly the Atlantic, although they crashed on arrival in America. Both were severely shaken up, Jim more than Amy.
I thought before leaving Bridgeport that maybe you would like to say something to the folks here.
Yes, I should like the opportunity of thanking everyone here for what they've done for us. No one could have been kinder or more considerate, and it's largely owing to their help that, well, at any rate, I'm feeling almost myself again. I'm afraid Jim got the worst of it, but you'll be all right in a day or two, won't you?
But others, including fellow Australian Charles Kingsford Smith, were determined to break Hinkler's record. In May 1928, Charles Kingsford Smith, with another Australian pilot, Charles Ulm, had set out to achieve the daunting aim of making the first flight from America to Australia. Starting from Oakland, California, they landed in their Fokker trimotor on Hawaii after a 27-hour flight across the Pacific. Because the runway here was too short for Southern Cross, as they called their aircraft, to take off with a full load of fuel, they moved to a beach. Having restowed their fuel, Kingsford Smith and Ulm took off for the island of Fiji, 3,150 miles away across the vast expanse of the Pacific. Battling their way through heavy cloud, they reached Fiji after 35 hours in the air. Brisbane, Kingsford Smith's hometown, was their final destination. This meant a further 20 hours of flying over nothing but the sea. They finally landed at Brisbane on the 9th of June 1928, 10 days after they had left Oakland. This and other Kingsford Smith flights were commemorated in Australia with a set of stamps bearing a picture of Southern Cross embracing the globe. 2 years later, and a few months after Amy Johnson's epic flight, Charles Kingsford Smith flew Southern Cross from Britain to Australia in just under 10 days, bringing the first air mails between the two countries with him. Smithy, as he was called by his fellow Australians, was fully aware of the risks involved.
There was an insistent question running through the corridors of their mind. Is everything all right? It hammers at the brain of every man who sets out on a long flight in a plane. It cannot be quite termed as anxiety. Rather, it's a blending of wonder and the sense of responsibility. Every nut and wire may look solid and may be as immovable as a cliff when the machine is at rest in the aerodrome. But one never knows quite what disturbing effects the terrific vibration of the engines may have.
In 1935, Kingsford Smith would disappear in the Indian Ocean while seeking to break the England-Australia solo flight record yet again. But other parts of the world had also been conquered by the aeroplane. In 1925, an Italian aristocrat, the Marquis de Pinedo, had flown by stages to Australia and then up to Japan before returning to Rome. His marathon journey took 6 months. De Pinedo then made several other trailblazing flights and became the leading Italian airman of his day. In September 1933, he embarked on a solo flight across the Atlantic from New York.
Addio, adios, goodbye everybody.
The heavily laden plane thundered down the runway. But while still over New York, de Pinedo experienced a problem. He returned to Floyd Bennett Field. The plane became Francisco de Pinedo's funeral pyre. In 1925, and across the other side of the world, 5 out of 6 Soviet aircraft which had set out from Moscow flew to the Chinese capital, Peking. This took them in stages across the trackless Gobi Desert and other remote areas. Then, in July 1931, Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne set out from Washington, D.C. to fly to Tokyo, Japan, and survey a route for Pan Am.
And First Lady of the Air are off on the first leg of their flight to the Orient.
They followed the Great Circle route between the two capitals. The Lindberghs landed in Tokyo Bay a month after they set out, and later flew on to China. The 1930s, however, saw round-the-world flights come back into vogue, with the German Graf Zeppelin airship leading the way. Newspaper magnate Randolph Hearst agreed to finance a global flight by the Graf Zeppelin in return for exclusive rights to the story, and the mighty airship left Lakehurst, New Jersey on the 8th of August 1929, with fare-paying passengers on board. Its route took it to the home of the Zeppelins, at Friedrichshafen on Lake Constance on the German-Swiss border, and then to Tokyo. The Graf Zeppelin now crossed the Pacific to San Francisco before returning to Lakehurst 21 days after it had set out. But if an airship could circumnavigate the globe, so could an aircraft. On the 23rd of June 1931, one-eyed pilot Wiley Post prepared to take off from Roosevelt Field, Long Island, with navigator Harold Gatty. They were flying a Lockheed Vega called Winnie Mae. Eight and a half days later, Post and Gatty returned, having flown eastwards through Europe, Russia, Alaska, and Canada. But their flight could not be ratified as a record, since the minimum acceptable distance was 23,000 miles, the circumference of the globe, and Post and Gatty had flown a mere 15,600 miles. Undeterred, 2 years later, Wiley Post tried again in Winnie Mae, this time alone, flying the same route, cutting 21 hours off his previous time. One who was inspired by Post's flights was Amelia Earhart, who now set her heart on achieving the first true circumnavigation by an aircraft. Post helped her to obtain a Lockheed Electra, more powerful than the single-engined Vega. As for her crew,
this is Paul Mance, famous pilot, who is helping me on the forthcoming flight, as he has on several previous ones. On my left is Captain Harry Manning, who will serve as navigator on the long Pacific overwater jump. Contemplated course covers about 27,000 miles. It will be the first flight, if successful, which approximates the equator. Indeed, I crossed the equator 4 times.
Earhart and her crew set off from Oakland, California in March 1937. Their first stage was westwards, across the Pacific to Honolulu. They completed this in record time. But when it came to take off for the next leg across the Pacific, the additional fuel taken on board proved too much for the Electra, and its undercarriage collapsed. Amelia brought her wrecked aircraft back to mainland America by sea. Determined to try again, she personally supervised every stage of the Electra's rebuild. For her next attempt, Amelia decided to do all the flying herself and took just a navigator. This was Australian Fred Noonan, who, although a heavy drinker, was widely respected for his skill. The two decided to fly west to east because of the weather. At Oakland Airport on the 19th of May 1937, Amelia bade farewell to her husband and chief publicist, George Putnam. she and Noonan then took off. Their route was to take them across the United States to Miami and down to Natal on the Brazilian coast. From here, they crossed the Atlantic to Senegal. On across Africa and the Indian Ocean they flew. Earhart and Noonan then battled their way through monsoon storms across India and down to Singapore. They reached Darwin in northern Australia on the 27th of June, just under 6 weeks since they had set out. Their route now took them to Lae in New Guinea, from where they faced the longest hop of all, almost 2,600 miles to tiny Howland Island, before flying on to Hawaii and home. On Howland itself, refueling facilities had been set up for Amelia in spite of its remoteness. On the 2nd of July 1937, Earhart and Noonan took off from Lae, but maintained radio contact with the airfield for some hours. Amelia then changed radio frequencies, which enabled her to speak to the US Coast Guard cutter Itasca, which was positioned near Howland Island. Eventually, Amelia radioed that she was closing on the island, but that heavy cloud was preventing her from spotting the cutter. An hour later, she sent one more message, giving the bearing on which she was flying. After that, there was silence. In spite of a massive air-sea search, no trace of Earhart, Noonan, or their aircraft was ever found. Regardless of theories that they had been abducted by the Japanese, there seems little doubt that they met the fate of many a trailblazer, running out of fuel over the sea. There was one more circumnavigation before the outbreak of war in 1939. In July 1938, multimillionaire Howard Hughes and a 4-man crew flew their Lockheed Super Electra over much the same route as Wiley Post. They did so in just under 4 days. This was twice as quick as Post's flights, and was an indication of how rapidly aviation technology was developing. For Hughes himself, it was the culmination of a series of record-breaking flights. By 1939, however, commercial aviation was operating in almost every part of the world. But this was largely thanks to those brave pioneers who had trailblazed the routes. What was it that motivated these men and women, who so often put their lives on the line in their determination to conquer the air? Let one of them, Britain's Sir Alan Cobham, provide an answer.
By means of aviation, we are going to learn more about geography than by any other development in history. The speed of flying will make us realize how small the world is and how petty our quarrels. For aviation cares naught for frontiers, and by this quickened means of transport, the races of the earth will have greater intercourse with and a knowledge of one another.